But what happened this summer was that terrorists appeared not as hiding in the population, but as a state within a state. In Lebanon, and to some extent, a lesser extent in Iraq, they emerge as organized, visible groups. In the Hezbollah in Lebanon controls a specific territory. It participates in the government, but it isn't bound by the decisions of the government. It conducts wars against the wishes of the government where it is located, and imports arms on its own account. And all of this creates a new phenomenon of a state within a state. And that is of significance for the following reason. And let me be professorial for 5 minutes here. The international system that we are familiar with, that we sort of take for granted, really evolved only in the 17th century. After the religious wars in Europe, in which about 30% of the population of Central Europe died as a result of attempts to make people conform to religious preferences. The rulers of that period decided they needed a new system. And they developed what we now take for granted, the concept of the modern state. And that state was supposed to be sovereign within its own territory. And it was supposed to be free from interference in its domestic affairs by outside countries. Aggression was defined as the movement of military units across established borders of a sovereign state. And international law was developed, all of this from the 17th century on, in order to regulate how states should deal with each other. Now, all of this is under attack now because the terrorist groups, of course, don't think of themselves as terrorists. They think of themselves as representatives of a new order which is trying to overthrow the state system in the creation of which they, of course, had no role. But the basic issue is whether the state system can continue. And if the state start disintegrating, then on what is international order and international law to be based? That is the heart of the issue. And this is why when one talks of solving these problems, either the system of states can be resurrected, or we're going to be living in a world of extreme turmoil in which issues will be settled by force until something new emerges. Now, we don't recognize this fully because we live in an established state that has no real challenge. But even in Europe, the states that we knew are sort of weakening, and they're trying to find a new system based called the European Union. But they're doing it by constitutional means and by the methods by which they grew up as nations. But that is not the situation in the Middle East. And so we live in a world in which there are really 3 or 4 different international systems are occurring simultaneously. As I said, in Europe, the nation state is weakening, and the dilemmas of Europe are that the nations are caught between their past, which they're trying to overcome, and their future in the European Union, which they haven't yet reached. And so they find it very difficult to make sacrifices in case of domestic reform, where they all know what is needed, but they cannot bring themselves to make sacrifices for a future that they cannot yet fully define. But in Asia, we have countries that still act like the European states did in the 19th century. They still think of each other as potential rivals. But with those countries, we have some practical problems, but no conceptual problems. It's in the Middle East that the conflicts are conducted like they were in Europe during the religious wars, and where the state boundaries are not taken very seriously because many of them were only established after World War I. There was no Iraq or Jordan, or for that matter Saudi Arabia, until 1920. They all emerged out of World War I, and not out of a history like America or Europe. And therefore, these terrorist groups, or whatever you want to call them, have a special power in those regions. Now, all of this is made even more difficult when you look at weapons of mass destruction. Until the discovery of weapons of mass destruction, wars could be terrible, but there was still some relationship between the sacrifice of a war and the purpose of a conflict. But when you look at a war that can cause tens of millions of casualties, you have to ask yourself what the purpose of political life is. I can tell you from my personal experience, I was one of the 3 or 4 people who would be asked if nuclear war were ever considered by a president, including, of course, President Ford when he was president. We never reached that point. But you have to consider the weight, especially on the president, who knows that if he's ever asked to make that decision, tens of millions of people could be killed in a matter of days. And then you can say, of course, nobody should ever do that. But if you do that, if you say that, you turn the world over to the most brutal, genocidal, ruthless rulers threatening you with these weapons. Now, we in the administrations in which I served, but all other American administrations of both parties, managed to navigate this problem in the Cold War